When historians describe the year 1910 in Paris, they usually focus on the catastrophe above ground, the swollen Seine, the flooded streets, the 200,000 refugees, the city transformed into a network of canals. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple drainage operation. Engineers were instructed to pump water from the metro tunnels, inspect foundations across the flooded districts, and determine whether the underground infrastructure could support the weight of a modern city once the waters receded. The goal was practical: drain the chambers, assess the damage, and prepare for recovery. But the moment workers began clearing the sediment left behind by the flood, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in centuries. Beneath the metro stations, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found walls and chambers that didn't match any municipal records. Their alignment was unusual, their depth was extraordinary, and the stonework didn't resemble anything in Parisian building history. It didn't even resemble Roman lutetia as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in public reports about flood recovery. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Paris's resilience. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: unforeseen structures, unexpected depth, older than anticipated. The official story would later simplify all of this into ancient quarry remnants, medieval sewer construction, or simply misidentified geology. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim government offices while Paris pumped itself dry, show something different. They show workers standing beside stone blocks cut with precision far cleaner than any known tool of the era should allow. Blocks fitted together so tightly that even in the poor lighting of 1910 photography, no mortar seams are visible. Patterns carved into floors that don't resemble any known French civilization, but something older, more geometric, more deliberate. And the deeper they drained, the more the layers stopped looking like history as we know it, and more like history that had been built over, submerged, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the drainage teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old quarries, abandoned medieval cellars, natural limestone caverns shaped by underground rivers. But as notes accumulated and more chambers were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the substructures built to support a weight far greater than anything above them? Why were certain stones shaped in near modular form as if manufactured rather than carved on site? Why did some corridors extend into darkness far beyond the footprint of any documented building? And the question that troubled even the most traditional engineers: why were these deeper structures so massive? Paris in 1910 was already a city of grand scale. Yet the foundational stonework beneath parts of the 1st, 4th and 7th arrondissements appeared built for something far larger than boulevards and monuments. Drainage teams quietly admitted among themselves that the depth and scale didn't line up with any historical records. And although none of them were using terms like lost civilizations, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built on this land before. Not villages, not settlements, a city, a lower city. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the widest angles of the chambers, and then the excavation zones were partially sealed again in late 1910, filled in where needed for stability, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible: structures too large for any known Parisian settlement, stonework too precise for the accepted timeline, architectural methods that look inherited, foundations that seem to belong to a different era of building entirely. When the drainage teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath Paris, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find metro construction debris, perhaps some medieval foundations and scattered remnants from Roman Lutetia. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks that assumption collapsed because instead of a neat sequence of historical phases, the teams uncovered a stack of architectural layers that didn't behave the way layers of a normal city are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was alignment. Each layer, metro construction, medieval sewers, Roman remains, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same orientation, the same angles, the same geometric grid. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different cultures, different millennia. They don't build in perfect alignment with people who live thousands of years apart. Yet beneath Paris they did. Vaults from one era sat directly above vaults from another. Corridors lined up with corridors buried meters below them. Load-bearing walls shared the same trajectory even when separated by unknown centuries. It was as if every group that ever built on this soil was copying an original blueprint, one that no longer existed in any historical record. As the workers drained deeper chambers, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected limestone and clay, they began encountering stonework that looked nothing like natural formation. Much larger blocks, much tighter joints, patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Paris's documented timeline. Some vaults appeared almost overbuilt, arched chambers with flawless curvature, crafted with a precision that didn't match the crude tools of medieval France or even Roman engineering. Spaces carved with geometric perfection, as if the builders understood principles of load distribution that wouldn't be formalized for centuries. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering team: water-worn foundations at impossible depths, stone surfaces smoothed as if shaped by centuries of running water, lower corridors with erosion marks, floors with a sheen that only forms after prolonged saturation. But here's what made no sense. These water-worn layers were found below the Seine's known flood levels, below the water table, in chambers that, according to all geological records, should never have been exposed to flowing water at all. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Massive stone blocks, polished smooth by hydraulic action, sitting in layers supposedly carved long before the Seine took its current course. Recovery photographs taken in 1910 show this clearly. Workers standing beside blocks so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Stones cut so precisely that even today stonemasons study the archival images in disbelief. Angles and joints that resemble megalithic sites, far older and far more advanced than anything medieval Paris is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs, it was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the flood barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest chambers entirely. Certain layers of stonework are summarized with vague terms like geological anomalies or earlier foundations, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual construction techniques documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across municipal archives instead of gathered into a single federal report? Even some of the stone blocks raised a red flag. Edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, grooves too uniform, marks that look less like natural erosion and more like precision cutting. Cutting that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those stones were supposedly formed. What the drainage teams uncovered were structures that didn't match Roman engineering, didn't match medieval craftsmanship, and didn't even match each other. Instead, they formed a strange architectural language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude cellars or narrow catacombs. They were geometrically perfect spaces, rooms shaped with exact ratios, arches that held their curve flawlessly across centuries, and stone vaults laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master blueprint that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with waterlogged sediment so dense that workers thought they had hit natural bedrock. But once cleared, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted stone, and construction patterns that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the grand circular platforms. Officially, they were later labelled as ancient wells or medieval gathering cisterns, but nothing about them fits typical water collection design. These were too symmetrical, too massive, and too perfectly level, as if they were foundations for structures of enormous weight and importance. Some platforms were wide enough for dozens of people to stand upon. Others showed radial patterns carved into their surface, almost like the base for rotating architecture or astronomical observation. Workers from 1910 described them in private correspondence as ceremonial foundations, not utility structures, but platforms with a monumental purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the placement of certain support columns. These were not simply resting on the floor below. Many were positioned with load calculations that made no architectural sense for the buildings above them. They were over-engineered, built to support weights far greater than any structure Paris officially possessed. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The modern city may not simply rest on natural limestone. It may sit on something much larger, a subterranean complex whose proportions were never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of France. The deeper the workers drained, the stranger the findings became. Stone blocks appeared with perfectly straight edges. Some surfaces were polished, smooth, almost reflective. Others showed precision-cut lines so clean that modern stonemasons still argue about what tools could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the metal embedded inside ancient stone. Some pieces looked fused, melted, or crystallized into the limestone itself. Yet they were found in layers supposedly older than any metallurgy advanced enough to produce such effects. The official explanation offered later: natural mineral deposits, iron oxide staining. But that does not explain why the metal appears in patterns, not randomly distributed, but placed, shaped, arranged like the stone was formed around it or after it. That kind of effect requires temperatures far beyond natural cave formation, far beyond medieval forging, and far beyond anything recorded in Parisian history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were sealed again. Corridors were filled with concrete. Deep sections of the sites were cut off from further inspection. Some of this was officially labelled as structural safety concerns, necessary to prevent further flooding and cave-ins. But the decisions about which chambers to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the rooms that were closed immediately were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly level platforms, the over-engineered columns, the strange metal inclusions, the engineered corridors that seemed to continue far beyond the drainage zone. These corridors were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random tunnels, they were part of an organised pattern, a grid of passages that looked less like caves and more like infrastructure. Aligned, measured, planned, as if they once connected to a much larger underground network, one that extended beneath the city long before any civilization, we acknowledge, ever walked the surface. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent maps. When you study the final weeks of the 1910 flood recovery, something becomes impossible to ignore. The projects didn't end, they were stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the drainage teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last chambers they drained beneath Paris weren't ordinary. They weren't geological. They weren't Roman remnants. They weren't even identifiable. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described stonework that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Walls with joints so tight you couldn't fit a razor between them. Curved ceilings shaped with precision that medieval France was never supposed to have. Platforms built for loads far heavier than anything documented above them, and corridors that extended beyond the drainage zone, disappearing into darkness below modern Paris. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced chambers were the ones that were reburied first. Workers described filling entire rooms back in with concrete, sealing entrances permanently, packing modern materials into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: geological instability, flood prevention, public safety. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally perfect chambers the ones sealed first? And why were the most unstable medieval foundations left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper layers posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the foundations beneath Paris truly showed construction techniques beyond Roman capability, and if some of those chambers didn't match any known civilization at all, then the entire accepted story of French and European history begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if Paris were built on top of something far older, something massive, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't natural formations, but deliberate attempts by later peoples to hide or repurpose what came before. And maybe that is why the 1910 discoveries were quietly reburied. Not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to blocks that look almost machined, arches that resemble structural ribs, floor systems too uniform for their supposed age, platform foundations built for a scale of architecture Paris never officially possessed. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest architecture, the most advanced layers sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The perfect stonework was buried. The grand circular platforms were buried. The unexplained corridors were buried. The oversized foundations were buried. The melted metal inclusions were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the flood recovery had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than Roman Lutetia, older than the Gauls, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1910, the waters opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Paris's grand boulevards stand on top of structures built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1910. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world, what other floods, what other disasters, what other convenient catastrophes exposed the depths just long enough for someone to bury what was below. The 1910 flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about the City of Light. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still waits in the darkness beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time.